After first experiencing survival back in 2016, it has since become my favorite way of playing a Fallout game. Ever since then, almost every subsequent Fallout 4 playthrough I've had has been on this difficulty. I wish I could experience Fallout 3 in New Vegas this way because I love it so damn much. But at the same time, I also absolutely despise it. For its unfair difficulty spikes, sure, but also because other issues arise which make me question if a Fallout game is the best vessel for this sort of difficulty mode. To that end, this video's goal is to provide a fair analysis of the mode in order to determine if it makes an appropriate template for future Fallout hardcore difficulty modes. But first, I'll briefly explain what the mode is all about. Fallout 4 Survival Mode was released on March 29, 2016, a little over 4 months after the initial launch of Fallout 4, and promised to be the ultimate challenge. On the changes made by Survival, Bethesda designer Josh Hamrick said this: "My favorite moments in games are when my decisions are validated, even when that means a poor choice leads to things going sideways or completely south. The stories that those moments deliver are always the best. I think that's the common thread running through all the changes we've made." Bethesda's more nuanced approach to difficulty in Survival reflects this. Rather than artificially inflating enemy health and damage output, Bethesda chose to fundamentally change how the game is played by implementing unique adjustments which would validate player decision making above all else. Here's a brief list of the more important additions. Sleeping. Your character is now constantly growing tired. It's also the only way to save. No more quick saving. Eating and keeping hydrated. Your character will also constantly be growing hungry and thirsty. You'll suffer ill effects if they're not tended to. And finally, there is no more fast travel. There is obviously much more to this mode, and I'll explore its more important facets later on, but for now, let's stick with these, the 3 pillars which Survival is built upon. Now before we begin, I just want to mention that Survival is meant to be the game's hardest and most unforgiving difficulty, and should therefore be reviewed with that in mind. This obviously doesn't mean that I'll pardon unfair mechanics or additions that will increase tedium more than anything else, but I still thought that it was relevant to mention. With that being said, this video is an analysis of a mode which changes gameplay rather than the narrative. This means that I'll avoid discussing the story unless it's relevant to my point and absolutely necessary. I'll be spoiling key plot points only in passing, so consider this your spoiler warning. The first item on the list is combat. I'm starting with this because it's the part of the game which received the most significant overhaul with the introduction of Survival. While many other games chose to double or even triple the enemy's base health and damage on the highest difficulty, Fallout 4 Survival Mode chose a slightly different approach to this, and in order to determine said approach, we need to crunch some numbers. For comparison's sake, the game's second highest difficulty, which is very hard, doubles enemy damage while halving the player's damage output. Survival, on the other hand, quadruples enemy damage and shaves 25% off the player's damage. This might come as a bit of a shock to those who've played Survival. Not the increase in enemy damage, but the decrease in player damage. A lot of players who've experienced Survival Mode, myself included, seem to get the impression that everyone gets a boost in damage. I personally thought that player damage had at least increased by 50%. This impression stems from the addition of Adrenaline, a new mechanic which gives players a boost in damage for every 5 kills. In so doing, Survival's approach seems to be one of high risk and high reward, one where everything in the world is at risk of being killed in an instant, enemy and player. I'm a big fan of this approach, as it sidesteps the traps that are found in both high-level difficulties as well as lower difficulties. Firstly, it avoids that all-too-common problem of having bullet-sponged enemies in higher difficulty settings. Think of things like those bandits in Skyrim, which take like 30 hits to bring down when playing on Legendary. That's not hard, that's tedious. Instead of rewarding banging your head against an impossibly large health bar, Survival encourages careful and slow play. Explosives will now consistently one-shot the player, but most enemies as well. You have the choice to either build up your adrenaline meter and increase damage output by pushing forward and killing more enemies, or play it safe and sleep to save your progress at the cost of losing those adrenaline points. This high-risk, high-reward approach encourages players to be more aware of their surroundings, make more decisions during the heat of battle, and is enhanced further by the threat of sudden death always looming closely by. It's actually hard rather than tedious. Conversely, it also avoids what is known as the inverse difficulty curve. For the sake of clarity, the difficulty curve defines the progression of difficulty during the playthrough of a game. Optimally, the difficulty should be compatible with the player's current skill level and progress on a slow incline up the difficulty scale. It should walk a fine line between being overwhelmingly hard and being trivialized by how easy it is. Take a game like Hollow Knight as an example. In that game, the main method of pushing the difficulty curve upwards is by introducing increasingly harder enemies while giving players the necessary abilities to fight back. The catch is that each new ability demands more proficiency than the last and must be used in tandem to truly master the game. At the start, the knight's movesets are standard, a jump and a slash. The enemies reflect this. Steadily but surely, however, the knight's movesets expands as foes get more complex. Vengeful Spirit to deal with ranged enemies, the Mantis Claw to reach flying enemies, the Shade Cloak to dodge and weave through fast enemies, the list goes on. The game doesn't overwhelm the player with super hard enemies and the tools to defeat them all at once. It feeds them to the player steadily as the game goes on, giving players ample time to learn and master them, thus creating an optimal difficulty curve. Anyways, all that for me to say that the inverse difficulty curve is that, but, well, opposite. What I'm trying to say is the game gets steadily easier rather than harder. In RPGs, the difficulty curve is primarily a numbers game. It's dictated by your increased damage output compared to the enemy's resistance to it, and vice versa. In the case of RPGs, I would say that an optimal difficulty curve would be one wherein the player's gear struggles to keep up with the level increase in enemies. You're never melting them, nor does it take 7 centuries to kill like a rat or something. Unfortunately for Fallout, and most Bethesda titles for that matter, they're usually in the inverse difficulty curve section. At some point in the game's difficulty will be switched to baby bitch easy mode indefinitely when the player acquires that gun. Not this gun, that gun with asterisks. This gun, the really good gun that is way better than it's OP. You know what I mean. In Fallout 3, it's Vengeance. In New Vegas, it's the Medicine Stick. In Fallout 4, it's the Overseer's Guardian, etc., etc., etc. These guns are so good that they not only create an inverse difficulty curve, they create a difficulty trench. Thankfully, survival nullifies this, well, to a certain extent. Because remember, survival isn't about pitting you against bullet sponge enemies, it's about careful, slow play where both yourself and enemies can die in an instant. By taking this approach, that new shiny plasma caster you just found won't turn the rest of your playthrough into a cakewalk. Since most enemies only take a few shots to bring down in survival, that overpowered gun provides a small difficulty drop rather than a flatlining difficulty altogether. It's also important to note that having stronger weapons won't necessarily stop enemies from killing you in 2 to 3 hits either in survival. Even something like Ballistic Weaves, which virtually doubles your ballistic and energy resistance, does little to prevent more dangerous foes from killing you almost instantaneously. I'm not arguing that this is Hollow Knight level of optimal difficulty progression, because it's not even close. This isn't a perfect system. High-level enemies will still appear out of nowhere and one-shot you. It is, however, a vast improvement over the base game's difficulty trench. As I've said before, it's a mode that rewards careful play as much as gear level, and I'll take that over finding the gun with the highest DPS and sleepwalk through the rest of the game every single time. The second facet of the base gameplay in Fallout would be health and healing, basically what you do in active combat when you aren't shooting. Before talking about the changes survival brought to this, I first want to analyze how the base game of Fallout 4 changed Fallout's healing system for the better. I'd argue that, without a doubt, the easiest Fallout game has to be 3, not because of its enemies or its overpowered guns, but because of its healing system. For those who haven't played the game, Stimpaks and, well, every other healing item in the game for that matter, heal you instantaneously rather than over time. And if you combine this with the fact that you have to pull out your magical time-stopping Pip-Boy to access your healing items, well, you can see how enemies would have a hard time killing you. In other words, if you have Stimpaks in your inventory, you straight up cannot die. New Vegas tried to rectify this by removing instantaneous healing for food, but not Stimpaks. Thankfully, the game's hardcore mode made it so Stimpaks also healed you over time, which was a step in the right direction. Fallout 4 builds on these improvements by making one small addition, a brief animation playing when consuming a Stimpak. This plays regardless of if it was equipped in the hotkey menu or not, and in implementing this small change, it was never always advantageous to heal. The player now has to consider whether to take a brief pause from shooting in order to heal, or keep shooting and hope that they kill the enemy before they kill him. Okay, at this point you might be thinking, this wasn't my experience at all. You might have never made these decisions in your head while playing, and that's fine. I'll admit, I might have indulged in a bit of overstatement when talking about just how much of a change the base game of Fallout 4 made to the healing system. But that's in reference to the base game. Survival is a completely different story. It if we're talking about survival, I fully stand by what I said because now the healing is so much slower. By my count, healing in survival is now 10 times slower than in the base game. This forces the player to stop and think before healing, because now the threat of being killed 10 times over before the Stimpak even heals you completely is very real. The amount of Stimpaks doesn't matter nearly as much as before because now they have a more tactical use. Your chances of survival are dictated by when you heal rather than how many healing items you have in your inventory. And in this sense, a lot of comparisons can be drawn between this and a game that, to my knowledge anyways, no game has ever been compared to, I think, ever. Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 2 specifically because it introduces the Healing Gem, an alternative healing item. Unlike the Estus Flask, which heals you almost instantaneously at the cost of halting player movement, the Healing Gem heals you slower and over a much longer period of time, while also slowing the player's pace to a walking speed rather than stopping them outright. In this, the advantages which the Healing Gem holds over the Estus Flask can be translated to the Stimpak, most notably its maneuverability. Just like the player can pop a Healing Gem in order to heal while avoiding incoming damage, follow players can choose to simultaneously inject a Stimpak while seeking cover. A player could also preemptively consume a Stimpak if they plan on taking heavy damage. It's simply a more nuanced approach to healing, one that encourages critical decision making in the heat of battle. To put it in a different way, Fallout 4's revamped healing system, just like the actual combat, is more than just a numbers game. It lives up to its action RPG status. In his 1 year later analysis on Fallout 4, Joseph Anderson talks about the gameplay loop, which he divides into 3 categories: exploration, combat, and gathering. This is the template I'm going to use to explore how survival affects Fallout 4's core gameplay loop, and since I've already covered combat, this section will focus on what precedes and follows it. Though most people probably think of adventuring out in the wasteland when they think of exploring, I also want to extend this section to what directly precedes this: preparation. This, in my opinion, is what changes the most with survival thanks to 2 changes: the removal of fast travel and reduced carry weight. Survival puts a much larger emphasis on the preparation aspect of traveling. It's a mode that encourages prudence and careful planning above all else. Let's first explore how carry capacity affects this. On top of carry weight being reduced by 75 pounds, ammunition is now weighted in survival. Gone are the days of carrying infinite amount of ammo for those 7 guns you're lugging around, 2 of which you actually use. Players now must not only consider how many guns they want to bring with them, but how much ammo. On top of that, we need to take the need to eat and drink into consideration. Given the fact that water and most animal meat weigh a whole pound, it would be ill-advised to carry all acquired consumables on your person at all times. This makes the player preemptively ask themselves the pros and cons of bringing certain gear with them. Am I going into a hostile environment? Do I need Radaway? Will I potentially go a long time without sleeping and should bring Nuka-Cola to counteract this? Will I need a lot of ammo, or should I risk carrying less to bring back more? And this notion is only heightened by the lack of fast travel. Players must now also consider the journey back. Should I explore this location to save and potentially avoid a death that could cost me hours? Should I push on or loot somewhere on the way back? You get the idea. It's this laser focus on efficiency that, in my opinion, makes this mode so damn compelling. It's both rewarding for a meticulous player and makes the game that much more immersive. It isn't immersive despite being unforgiving, it's immersive wholly because it's unforgiving. It's a game about a post-nuclear apocalyptic hellscape after all, and to me, this is the best way to experience that. Now moving on to exploration proper. I firmly believe that Fallout 4 has the best exploration out of any Fallout game. The environment is richly colored and varied, providing a much-needed change of scenery from Fallout 3's bleak landscape, all the while avoiding the trap of looking like a bunch of theme park-like levels like in Fallout 76. More specifically, I love it so much because of how wonderfully cluttered it is, both inside and out. Visually, of course, but also in the way the levels are structured. Its height, the number of enemies within it, the lootable items scattered all over the place. It's why the premise of most quests in Fallout 4 usually boil down to go to a random location, kill everything in sight, and loot something over something more story-driven like in Fallout New Vegas. Now this doesn't mean that one is better than the other, simply that they're different. One has advantages and disadvantages that the other doesn't. And that's besides the point anyway. The important thing to note is that Fallout 4's content is found in these dense, intricate levels, and I love that survival plays to this strength. It slows the player down and makes them appreciate these lovingly handcrafted dungeons. That's why I find it so frustrating that quite a few quests are seriously crippled by survival's lack of fast travel. Most notably, I'm talking about the back and forth quests, the ones where you need to return to the same location numerous times to complete a quest. An example would be retrieving parts for the teleporter in order to reach the Institute. The most glaring examples, however, are undoubtedly Preston's infamous settlement quests. Now before I get into this, I first have to defend my boy Preston a bit. Don't get me wrong, Radiant quests are usually little more than means to artificially extend the game, and having them as your primary quest generator for one of your main faction's questline is lazy as hell. Where I disagree with a lot of the community is how this somehow makes these Radiant quests infinitely crappier than your standard Fallout 4 quests. It's lazy, sure, but I'd argue that it's not nearly as bad as people make it out to be, mainly because this barely diverges from the game's usual quest philosophy of go here and kill that. The Silver Shroud, Here There Be Monsters, The Secret of Cabot House, widely regarded as some of the game's best quest content, all adhere to these simple guidelines. Now this doesn't make every quest in Fallout 4 lazy copy-pasted garbage, of course not. Having context behind your mass murder spree is always appreciated, even when it's not always exactly well written. What I'm trying to say with this is that Mr. Gravy's quest slot machines aren't all that bad. The context is non-existent for sure, but the meat of the game is still in the spotlight. You're still exploring these fantastically handcrafted levels. That's why it's such a shame that they're made so agonizing with survival. Let me explain. The problem comes with the way NPCs are set up. After receiving the quest from Preston, you have to travel all the way to the settlers' little shitty mutt hut, go kill whatever needs killing, travel back to the settlers, tell them the job is done, and then go back to Preston to tell them the same thing. Rinse and repeat. In the base game, this is annoying at worst. Fast travel to the settlers, fast travel back to Preston, suffer through a few loading screens, and it's done. In survival, this becomes complete and total agony. Gone is the careful planning that goes into exploratory preparation. In survival, the bulk of these quests' content is mindlessly following a quest marker around back and forth across the Commonwealth until it's done. It's mind-numbing nothing, and I hate it. And don't get me started on the quest involving the castle, where Preston inexplicably moves from a well-fortified freaking castle to move back to Bumfuck Sanctuary, which is on the literal opposite side of the map. Have fun traveling between the two for a quest or 5, loser. Well, at least the Brotherhood of Steel signal grenades now have a use, I guess. Trip is still boring though. Unfortunately, this is only one of the glaring problems brought to exploration with survival. Introducing the weighted ammo conundrum. While having 45 and energy cells weigh next to nothing ensure that rifles and pistol bills have more than a bit of wiggle room when it comes to the amount of ammo carried, the same cannot be said for explosives. Missiles, as in the ammunition for missile launchers, weigh a whopping 7 pounds, whereas a single Fat Man shell weighs a monstrous 12 pounds. And that's not even going into the weight of the weapons proper, which easily exceed the 20 and even 30 pound threshold. To put that into perspective, a starting player with an average strength scale of 5 begins survival with a measly 125 carrying capacity. Carrying as little as 6 missiles and a single missile launcher takes up half of your inventory. This isn't limited to explosive weapons either, as weapons like the minigun or the Gauss rifle and the Gatling laser also suffer similar downgrades. The unfortunate truth of exploring in survival is that it sacrifices multiple playstyle options for a more rewarding and immersive experience. Like I did with exploration, I also want to extend this section from what Joseph Anderson discussed in his video. To that end, I'll include trading in the gathering section. To be brief, gathering includes amassing resources after clearing a dungeon. Resources meaning things like ammo, weapons, aid, and most notably, junk. Players would then naturally sell the resources they don't need and buy the ones they do. Before talking about how survival plays into all of this, I first want to gush about Fallout 4's junk economy for a little bit. I can assure you that it's absolutely necessary. Rather than the worth of items being dictated by their weight to value ratio like previous Fallout games, Fallout 4's junk economy takes a more nuanced approach. In 4, everything requires the resources found in junk to be created. Gun mods, armor modifications, base building, drug crafting. Every piece of junk has its respective value because each craftable item demands unique material, some of which are exclusively found in a limited number of junk items. A player might have found turpentine to be useless earlier in their playthrough, only to find the antiseptics inside invaluable once they unlock the ability to craft stimpaks and other varying drugs at a chemistry station. Moreover, merchants are no longer reduced to currency vending machines. It's a common problem to have in this type of game. You reach a point where you no longer go to merchants to buy items you actually need. You simply exhaust their available currency and move on to the next merchant until you've cleared out the entire marketplace, and at that point you usually have no reason to have all that gold. I distinctly remember having to consistently move between 3 or 4 towns in Skyrim to sell all the armor and weapons I acquired, and I had something like 300,000 gold with nothing to spend it on. Even with its fantastic junk economy, the value of junk merchants in Fallout 4 would also slowly dwindle as the player amassed more and more junk for their one base. The junk merchant would slowly turn into yet another cap vending machine since the player had all the junk material they could ever want. This is once again a problem which the lack of fast travel alleviates, because it seriously cripples those who choose to have one base wherein they store all of their junk. Let me explain how these two systems relate to each other. Having to lug your resources between Sanctuary, the most common main base for most players, and Diamond City, which, trust me, in survival you're going to be doing a whole lot, will become agonizingly boring without fast travel. Instead, survival mode rewards another more interactive style of play, one I like to call the Wanderer. It's now much more intuitive to divide your resources amongst different outposts throughout the Commonwealth, preferably those close to prominent trading hubs, things like Hangman's Alley for Diamond City, Taffington Boathouse for Covenant, or Abernathy Farm for Drumlin Diner. By doing so, this creates different outposts dotted around the map where players can stop by to restock on their way to a quest or retrieve some valuables to trade with local trading hubs. This isn't limited to junk either. Things like ammo, which now has weight, or crucial food and water can be stored around your different beacons of civilization. Hell, if you want, you can go all out with this and invest time in the base building mechanics, get local leaders, set up trading routes, get some water purifiers going, and completely conquer the resource issue before it even becomes a problem. I think this style of play which survival encourages is fantastic, because it necessitates interacting with the world rather than simply being extra content which the player explores on a whim. The changes brought to the exploration and gathering in Fallout 4 accomplishes exactly what they intended to do in my opinion. The lowered carry weight, the lack of fast travel, the need to sleep, eat, and drink, they all come together to create this deliberate and efficient style of play promised with this mode. One where the player must first consciously plan out what gear they want to bring with them when going out to adventure thanks to the limited carry weight, then carefully pick out the locations they want to visit thanks to the lack of fast travel, and finally move to the closest beacon of civilization to trade, rest, and heal because of both the limited inventory and the lack of fast travel. If my review ended here, I would absolutely recommend this mode to those who want a more nuanced challenge in their Fallout experience. It's a little unfair at times and can seem a tad limited in terms of potential player builds, but the foundation is solid. I have no doubt in my mind that, with a bit of refinement, this could become the favored way of playing a Fallout game for many fans. As you can tell from the time remaining in this video, however, this isn't where my review ends. There's just enough time to include another section that could potentially invalidate all that I've said up until this point. I think it's time we talk about the big problem that plagues Fallout 4 survival. Now, before I reveal the big problem, which most of you have probably already guessed by now since, I am talking about a Bethesda game, I need to blue ball you just real quick and first talk about saving in survival since the big problem is directly linked to this. Because it was released months after the base game came out, it's hard to tell if Fallout 4 was built with the eventual implementation of survival in mind. This opening statement on survival from the official Bethesda website might shed some light on this matter. Survival mode is something many of us realized we wanted to experiment with once we had spent quality time playtesting Fallout 4 towards the end of its development. So if this is indeed true, this would mean that some elements of survival must have been taken into consideration during Fallout 4's development. Most importantly, I'm thinking about bed placements, because they essentially act as your only checkpoints, so considering their placement throughout the map is of the utmost importance. In my opinion, unfortunately, the distribution of bed in Fallout 4's map is sloppy. And look, I'm not asking to consistently find a bed in every single building. Quite the opposite actually. I love the thrill of potentially not finding a bed after clearing a dungeon. It adds a much needed element of randomness to the experience. It makes the game feel less like, well, a game. My problem is with the obvious lack of care that's been put into the bed placements in this game. I'm talking about things like the numerous beds throughout the map which visually seem like they'd be able to be slept on, yet when the player approaches it, the prompt to sleep on them doesn't appear, or the lack of bed during key quest points. A good example of this would be the assault on the Institute, which is arguably one of the hardest and longest gunfight in the entire game, yet no beds are to be seen. But the thing is, they do have beds. Obviously. They're misguided, xenophobic Dr. Frankenstein types that are stuck in an echo chamber, not bed Nazis. The beds are there, they're just locked off, likely to funnel the player in the direction they're supposed to go. And this is far from the only instance of a blatant disregard for survival players. The award for the most egregious example of this would undoubtedly go to this bed right here, which is in Virgil's Cave, which is in the middle of the Glowing Sea. As an aside, I first want to praise the Glowing Sea's portrayal in survival. In the base game, the worst that could happen to a player was receiving 10 rats per second, nothing Radix and Radaway can't solve. In survival, however, it becomes the hellscape it was no doubt originally intended to be. Want to take anti-rad medicine? Fuck you, you're tired now and you have miles of blasted out irradiated hell to trudge through before you reach your destination. Want to sleep outside to counteract the fatigue gained from taking those meds? Too bad, you can't sleep while receiving rad damage, idiot. The only way to save is to find some old dinky cave or submerged building and hope to God you'll find a mattress inside. Oh, and you'll probably get a disease from doing so, just in case you thought things were getting too easy. And even then, the best I could ever find after more than 1,000 hours invested in the game was a regular old mattress, never a full bed. This means that, as far as I'm concerned, it is impossible to get a full night's rest while inside the Glowing Sea. This is the exact sort of special survival brand hell I'm looking for when I play a game mode like this. Unfortunately, I think Bethesda took this a little too far by missing a huge opportunity. In survival or not, Virgil's Cave acts as a little sanctuary for players. This can largely be attributed to the lack of radiation inside, the half-dozen turrets safeguarding the place, and the absence of any sort of mutated abomination trying to rip your face off. This is all undermined by the fact that it is impossible to interact with the only actual bed inside the Glowing Sea, thus robbing players of an essential save point. Whether the player decides to head directly towards Virgil's Cave or explore and try to find a bed on the way there, the sheer distance between the edge of the Glowing Sea and his cave almost ensures that even the most experienced players will leave Virgil's Cave exhausted. I myself took both approaches numerous times, and it was only after the 4th try that I was quick enough to make it out of the Glowing Sea while still being able to walk. And to add salt to the wound, players are treated to one of the game's longest conversations. Thanks to the decision to have a voice protagonist, it takes just that much longer to get through Bethesda's stellar writing. It's not much, but trust me, it gets irritating after the 4th time. It's things like this that make me think that the bed placement in Fallout 4 was simply not tailored to a survival playthrough, and skimping on such an integral piece of the survival experience is inexcusable. There are also the inherent problems which come with this method of saving, which disrupts the player experience regardless of the amount of beds placed on the map. I'm talking about things like accidentally stealing an empty noodle cup when trying to interact with a merchant only for everyone in town to inexplicably turn hostile and mowing your ass down. In other words, the ones that force players to reload a previous save. The problem of not having a quick save feature then inevitably rears its ugly head. I'm not exactly sure how one would go about solving this problem. Maybe add a bounty system like they did in the Elder Scrolls game? Then at least the punishment for doing something so stupid and out of your control would be less severe. This would go along with that idea communicated in that quote I brought up at the beginning of the video. My favorite moments in games are when my decisions are validated, even when that means a poor choice leads to things going sideways or completely south. The stories that those moments deliver are always the best. I think that it's the common thread running through all of the changes we've made. A sentiment which seems to express a desire to rekindle their design philosophy from all the way back in 1996. Here's a short quote from Bethesda on the design philosophy for Daggerfall. Bethesda Softworks has worked very hard to make The Elder Scrolls Daggerfall a game that does not require players to replay their mistakes. All adversities can be overcome, excepting only the player's death. In fact, you will never see some of the most intriguing aspects of the game unless you play through your mistakes. To a certain extent, I think Survival's saving system achieves this goal reasonably well. Save scumming is something that I and many others are definitely guilty of. Well, I shouldn't say guilty, since everyone is free to play their single-player game however they damn please, but in the game's highest difficulty, I think it was a necessary change. Combat especially is affected by this philosophy, always being at a knife's edge, potentially threatening to boot the player back several hours in their playthrough if they aren't careful. Your choice during combat matters in survival. The same cannot be said for the story, whose linearity rarely takes advantage of the system. The only real consequences born from this philosophy are found in the combat and the game's flawed design, as I've said before, but also from something far, far worse. I think a fair statement to make about Bethesda's games is that, well, they aren't exactly the most stable. Some might even argue that they're downright broken. Their notoriety has gotten to a point where many debate if the endless bugs that plague their games are indeed bugs, or intended features rather. The phrase, "it's not a bug, it's a feature," pops up quite often in various forums when Bethesda games are mentioned. Now, when it comes to this section of the video, my interests aren't in bugs like raiders walking around headless after getting their faces blown off or cars falling from the skies. I'm talking more about those that force players to reload a previous save because it would have otherwise permanently affected their playthrough. To illustrate my point, here are a few examples that happened in my playthrough. Firstly, I had the lovely Miss Piper deciding that looking at these trees right here would be far more interesting than helping me clear the ghouls in Cambridge, and I only realized this because I had an unfinished quest which marked her location on my map. This happened when I was halfway across the Commonwealth. Unfortunately for me, fast travel doesn't exist in survival, so I had to hike all the way back to Treeland where I was promptly murdered twice on the way back. I don't mind having to tread back to previous locations because of a mistake that I've made, but when the reason for the backtracking is the game being a buggy piece of garbage, that's where it becomes kind of annoying. Another example was my man Ogden bugging out and deciding not to sell anti-radiation cams to me, even though I desperately needed them. This happened on 3 separate occasions, and all 3 led to my death. In vanilla Fallout 4, occurrences like these could easily be solved. I could have fast traveled back to Piper and avoided the failed trek to get her back. In Ogden's case, I could have simply fast traveled back to Diamond City to get more RadAway, or at least quick save before risking venturing further into the glowing sea. Sure, it's annoying to deal with in the first place, but in survival, it becomes unbearable. The truth of the matter is that Fallout 4, as it is right now, isn't sufficiently equipped to deal with the game-breaking glitches in a game mode as unforgiving as survival. Now this right here is only the tip of the iceberg, a small appetizer if you will. We still haven't talked about the big problem, which, without further ado, here it is. Yeah, I know, right? It's crazy, insane. It's a massive revelation to everyone here, I'm sure. Now, I'm not going to pretend like I know all the ins and outs of why a game crashes. In my case, it usually happens when I'm talking to a merchant, so I don't know. And the important thing is that Fallout games crash. They crash a lot, like way more than most games. Even 5 years after release, this thing crashes harder than a post-COVID economy. The interesting thing about all of this is that in the base game, it's not that big of a deal, or more accurately, it's not that big of a deal when compared to it happening in a game of survival. The reason being, of course, survival's saving mechanic. Now first let me say this, sleeping being the only method of saving in a game where you can potentially go hours without finding a bed is the ultimate challenge, and it's my favorite addition to survival. But that's in theory. Like I said before, the unfortunate truth is that Fallout 4 crashes like it's no one's business. I cannot overstate the importance of this. It is not only possible, but likely that players will lose hours of playtime because of their game just deciding to die. It must have happened to me a dozen times while recording footage for this video. It's unacceptable, and if this happens to anyone, I don't blame them one bit for never wanting to touch the game mode ever again. In the base game, it's annoying as hell for the game to crash, but giving the quick save and autosave features, you'll likely only lose a few minutes. In survival, it could be half your day's playtime or even more. Like the bugs, issues with the game's performance which were annoying in the base game become infuriating in survival. Despite how much I praised most of survival's changes, I fully understand why the last section would completely discourage anyone from ever touching the mode. Losing hours of progression to something that is completely out of your hands can be soul-crushing. Now it'd be easy to simply recommend the mode to those who feel as though their gear is good enough to support such a poorly optimized game, while simply discouraging those with shittier gear to stay away from the mode. This, I would argue, would be unfair to survival. In my opinion, the mode has hope of transcending these damning flaws. The recipe it's created is too damn good to abandon. So this brings us back to the question I posed in the beginning of the video. Is Fallout the right vessel for this sort of difficulty mode? And my answer to that is, Fallout 4, as it is fit to support survival for 2 types of players. Those with hardware that sufficiently prevents the game from crashing, and the hardcore Fallout player, whose love for the series outweigh their aversion to the game's poor performance. To truly reach its full potential, the torch that is Fallout survival mode must be passed on to the next entry in the series. So, I guess in this sense, this video is my plea to Bethesda. And I know you're watching this, Todd. I know you get all of your ideas from random video game essayists with absolutely zero experience in video game making. please don't let this mode be a one-time thing, an experiment in polarizing difficulty. I want to see the full potential of this mode realized. I want to experience the thrill of unforgiving combat, where my decisions actually matter, to be pushed to use every advantage at my disposal, to interact with the game's world out of necessity rather than on a whim, unhindered by something as stupid as my game crashing. I want to overcome the mistakes I've made as a player rather than the mistakes the game made, and to experience all the game has to offer specifically because of this. I dare to say Bethesda would agree with me on that.